When I was young, I had my own Home Alone adventure, but mine was not funny. When I was a kid, well, a young teenager, I frequently spent my Saturday nights babysitting my siblings. As the eldest of three, I assumed this responsibility with no pay nor thanks to speak of. It was simply expected of me, one of my contributions to the family. I babysat so frequently because, well, my parents needed it. They'd had marriage problems in the past, and their counselor told them they should go on a weekly date, revive the magic, rekindle the flame, all that good stuff. Yeah, it sucked to be robbed of a weekend evening, but it wasn't much of a burden. My parents were happier than they'd been in ages, and they both seemed genuinely excited for date night each week. I would have rather been doing other things, of course, but I'd seen my aunt and uncle go through a nasty divorce a few years back, and I desperately wanted my parents to stick together. And so it was that on the night of December 3rd, in the year 2006, I stood at the open front door of my secluded Colorado home, waving goodbye as my parents backed out of the icy driveway. "Drive safe," I called out, steam pouring from my mouth. I don't know if they heard me or not. Wrapping my arms around my torso in response to the wintry mountain air, I entertained myself for a few brief moments by exhaling forcefully and watching my breath float away into nothing. And there was truly nothing around me, not a car or a creature in sight. It wasn't long before I grew bored and turned back into the warm house, nose tingling from the chill. Georgie and Kate were eating their dinner at the kitchen table. As I watched them, I couldn't help feeling like an only child. Georgie, 3 years my junior, was severely autistic and not talkative. He only spoke when he really wanted something, and only then in the simplest of words. Milk and sandwich was code for peanut butter and jelly with the crust cut off, which he was presently devouring. Kate, meanwhile, was still a baby, just shy of 2. The 9-year gap between them is glaring, but to this day my parents swear to me Kate wasn't an accident. Kind of like back in high school, when I swore to them I had no idea how those magazines got under my mattress. But I digress. The kids finished dinner and I set them up with their entertainment for the night. Georgie in his room with the PlayStation 2, which was a hot commodity in those days, and Kate in her crib in front of Sesame Street. Myself, I ignited the basement fireplace, dimmed the overheads, and curled up with a book by the light of our Christmas tree. God, that was a nice house. Not a day goes by that I don't miss it. I read in perfect contentment for nearly an hour. Night had fallen by then, and the room had become toasty. I was beginning to doze off when I heard Georgie's heavy footfalls descending the staircase. I sat upright and looked at him expectantly as he waddled into the room. "No more knocking," he said, brow furrowed in annoyance. I shook my head. "I'm not knocking," I said. "Is someone at the door?" Georgie just stared at me blankly. "Georgie," I said, more clearly this time, "did someone knock on the door?" "No more knocking," he repeated. "Knocking on window." "Knocking on window?" I stood up, now wide awake. "Georgie, is someone knocking on your window?" "No more," he replied simply. I stood in silence for a moment, unsure of what to do. It was probably just one of my friends playing a prank, I thought, but being alone in a house that big makes you a little jumpy. My mind started to race through the situation. I was a 13-year-old boy in a nice house on the hilly outskirts of a Colorado mountain town. The streets were engulfed in trees, and there were no homes within a quarter-mile of my own. Our road saw next to no traffic, and the police station was a good 15 minutes away. It was probably my friends, I thought, but what if it wasn't? "Follow me," I told Georgie. Hand trembling slightly, I turned the knob and glanced up the staircase. It was dark up there. The only light came from Kate's room. "Kate!" I sprinted up the stairs to her room, where she remained happily perched in her crib, squawking with delight as Elmo fiddled with his crayons. I breathed a sigh of relief, but still my heart thumped in my chest. "This is silly," I told myself. "Be a man." I made my way down the hall to Georgie's room and stood tentatively at its door. Taking a deep breath, I gently pushed the door ajar, reaching for the light switch and thinking better of it. If this was the worst-case scenario, then I didn't want our mystery intruder to know where in the house I was. The only light in the room came from Star Wars, Battlefront's game-paused screen. I listened for a moment, but heard nothing. I began to suspect that Georgie had simply imagined the knocking. Somewhat exasperatedly, I moved to the window and flicked up a blind to reveal nothing. Just a landscape of freshly fallen snow backed by a quiet, lonely road. I watched the peaceful night, relieved, as the large flakes fell softly to the ground, my eyes trailing an individual fractal all the way to the footprints just beneath the window's frame. At first I did not comprehend them. I just stared, transfixed, at the deep imprints in the snow. Shoes, a man's shoes. None of my friends wore the size of that, I felt sure. I traced them backwards from the window to the sidewalk, from whence this intruder had evidently come. But where did they lead? It was a bright night. The moon shone proudly between the clouds. My eyes followed the steps across the front yard, but once they passed behind the giant pine, they disappeared. My heart leapt to my throat. Whoever had walked behind that tree was still there. In panic, I quickly backed away from the window. Georgie, sensing my fear, began to whimper. No, shh, I muttered, desperate to keep him quiet. I flicked the television off and led Georgie out of the room. I quickly pulled Kate from her crib, powered her TV down as well, and carried her down the stairs in the blackness. Can't see, Georgie said, and Kate began to cry. I shushed her hurriedly as we descended. Once in the basement den, I unplugged the Christmas tree so that the only light in the room came from the embers of the dying fire. I sat Georgie down on the couch and settled Kate in his arms. Sit right here, I directed, staring into his eyes. Don't move, do you understand? Do not move. I need to call the police. I would have called my parents, but this was 10 years ago, and they didn't have cell phones. So I took the stairs quickly and quietly, tiptoeing to the phone hanging from the wall of our living room. I picked up the phone and dialed 911, but I heard nothing. Silence. I slammed it on the receiver and picked it up again. Again, nothing. I think it was around this point that I started to cry. I couldn't help it. I was scared. I tried to calm myself down, telling myself that the storm had killed the phone line, but there wasn't much of a storm. The snow was steady, sure, but there wasn't even a breeze, certainly nothing that could have disabled our phone. Tentatively, I walked into Kate's room and peeked out the window. My first glance was toward the tree, of course, where the footprints stopped, but now they continued. Sometime while I was herding my siblings downstairs, whoever was behind the tree had moved. I followed the footsteps across my frozen front yard to a man standing near the driveway. He was looking right at me. My breath stopped. I was frozen in place. This was not one of my friends. I had never seen this man before. But he was looking at me with an eerie blankness. He was wearing a black turtleneck and black slacks, a lone dark spot on a blanket of purest white. My eyes never left him, and his never left me. We stood still, silently staring, for what seemed like an eternity. My heart thrummed in my chest, and I felt nauseous. For the first time, gazing into this man's eyes from afar, I began to consider the possibility of my death. I thought of my dad's brother who was killed in an accident at age 11. Forever 11, never growing up, frozen in time in the memories of all who knew him, as a soul of eternal youth. At this, the tears flowed freely once more. Please don't hurt us, I begged in a sobbing whisper. I knew he could not hear me, but I could not help myself. Finally, he broke eye contact with me and looked toward the heavens, toward the gently falling snow. He was saying something, but what, I could not hear. I stared, transfixed, as he pulled a handful of dark powder from his pocket. Then, still gazing upward, still muttering to himself, he flung the stuff at his feet. I desperately wanted to run, to get my siblings, but I thought that to let this man out of my sight would be unconscionably foolish. No, better to keep an eye on him. The house was still locked. I had the upper hand, I felt. Besides, I could not bring myself to look away from the strange ritual unfolding before me. The man had removed his sweater and flung it carelessly to the ground behind him. He was no longer staring skyward, but his lips continued to move. I trained my eyes intently upon his mouth, trying with no success to read his words, when I saw something glint in the moonlight. It was a knife, a long, callous blade, which he had removed from his other pocket. It bore dark stains already. From what? I covered my mouth to hush a scream as the man, still muttering to himself, ran the edge of the blade along his pale, distended stomach. A thin red line appeared along his abdomen, and blood of the deepest shade began to dribble from the wound. The streams trickled down his belly and fell ungracefully upon the black powder at his feet. At this, the man stared skyward once more, face contorted in a gruesome smile. He was sobbing uncontrollably, and mucus ran freely from his nostrils, but he looked happy. Beyond happy, elated. My stomach churned in revulsion. This man was in ecstasy. I watched, almost entranced by this bizarre unfolding, when the man's face changed suddenly. He looked directly at me once more, and his eyes appeared unhinged. Still clutching the knife, he began to sprint directly at my window. I took one look at the weapon this man brandished and instinctively fled the room. I slammed the door shut behind me and was halfway down the stairs when I heard the window shatter. The man screamed loudly in pain as I reached the basement. I locked the door behind me and ran to Georgie and Kate. "No more screaming," Georgie pleaded. No more screaming," I agreed in hushed tones, stroking his hair in an effort to calm him down. Kate, meanwhile, seemed happy as a clam. I strained, listening intently. Is he inside the house? I still clung to some naive hope that he had injured himself on the glass and had retreated, or perhaps he had been weakened by his self-inflicted wound. Finally, I heard it, the subtle but unmistakable sound of footsteps upstairs. He was indeed inside the house, and by the sound of it was trying to be quiet. I silently guided Georgie and Kate into a storage closet and closed the door behind us, manipulating the handle to make as little noise as possible. We stayed there for about 5 minutes, listening to the ceiling creak threateningly above us. Then I realized, I don't know why it took me so long, that we were not trapped. We still had a way out. I saw in my mind's eye a window well in the bathroom down the hall, the only access our basement had to the outside world. Almost as if on cue, a frustrated scream echoed from above, followed by a tremendous crash. He had pulled something to the ground, perhaps the entertainment stand or maybe the hutch. "He's here!" the man shrieked hysterically. "How dare you hide from him?" To this day, I don't know who he was talking about. But it was at that moment, the moment I heard him begin to descend the stairs, that I made my move. Holding Kate in one arm and guiding Georgie with the other, we began our flight down the hallway. As we reached the bathroom, I stared fixedly at the window near the ceiling. It would be a tight fit, but we could make it. I flung the window open, stood on the toilet, and placed Kate gently in the shallow window well. Then I stepped off and told Georgie to get on. "Yucky, gross, no standing on toilet," he said, looking embarrassed. I heard the man fumble with the locked handle at the base of the stairs. Time was running out. I'm not proud of what I did next, but it was the only way I could think of to get Georgie to cooperate. I smacked my brother roughly across the face and grabbed him by the shirt with both hands. "Georgie, get on the fucking toilet," I snarled at him the first time I had ever said that word. He began to wail in pain and surprise, but he did step onto the toilet all the same. "Climb out the window," I directed in a harsh tone, and as he grabbed the ledge, I used all the strength I could muster to help push him up. Once he almost slipped back down, almost, but he was stronger than I thought he was, and managed to pull himself back up. With both of my siblings safely in the window well, I climbed on the toilet one last time and gripped the edge of the windowsill. As I clambered out myself, I heard a raucous crash. The man had broken down the basement door. With one last hoist, I pulled my legs up through the window and shut it quietly behind me. As I helped my siblings out of the well, I heard one last anguished shout from the man, muffled through the pane of glass. "Why are you hiding from him?" "Cold," screamed Georgie as I led him, barefoot, through the snowy grass. In panic, I shushed him, but it was no use. He and Kate were both crying quite loudly by this point. My only hope was to get them as far away from the house as possible. I heard a distant crash from inside the house, and I quickened our pace. Feet numb, I sprinted through the yard to the sidewalk and practically had to drag Georgie onto it. "Bathroom light on," he said pleadingly. He was obsessive about turning off lights and electronics before leaving, and he was correct. We had left the bathroom light on in our haste. I ignored him and rushed us down the frozen pavement, stepping on sharp rocks and sticks and not even comprehending it. Adrenaline surged through my veins. I didn't know what we were headed toward. All I knew is what we were headed away from. The snow was falling much harder by this point. I could already see it collecting in a pile on Kate's head. Her nose was beet red and dripping with snot. I needed to get her inside. But where? I looked ahead and saw a light off in the distance, the Garland's house. I'd said maybe a grand total of 6 words to Mr. and Mrs. Garland my entire life. But that was our one option. It was in their house that we would seek refuge. My house was now around the corner and out of sight, but I did not let up the pace until Georgie tripped on something and landed in a dark puddle. "Hey!" he screamed indignantly, looking back at his stumbling block. In the glow of the distant streetlight, I could see Georgie had fallen into blood. A dead man lay, face up and eyes open, on the sidewalk. Snow had fallen onto most of him, and he had been mostly invisible until Georgie's feet had connected with his midsection. I remembered the dark stain I had seen on our intruder's knife. "Come on," I pled, wrenching my eyes away from the grisly scene as I pulled Georgie to his feet. We ran for another 60 seconds maybe, and finally reached the Garlands' front door. The window into their parlor was open and a fire was roaring. Mr. and Mrs. Garland sat drinking tea in cozy armchairs. I pounded ferociously on their door. They answered together, utter bewilderment stamped on their faces. I handed Kate to Mrs. Garland and collapsed into tears. The police arrived at my home 15 minutes later and apprehended the man, unconscious, lying in a crumpled heap on the floor of our basement bathroom. They discovered him with a fractured skull, many deep lacerations from the window of Kate's room, and intestines partially protruding from the wound on his gut. He had slipped in his attempt to climb where we had climbed, hit his head, and knocked himself out. Apparently, he confessed under questioning that he was a member of a strange cult, a cult which, as far as anyone can tell, does not even exist. He claimed to have been taking part in a ritual which required the sacrifice of a pure soul, and my autistic brother had been his target that night. My parents have not shared with me all the details of what happened after that night, but as far as I know, our intruder is currently rotting in a cell. The man he killed, the man lying on the sidewalk, was a friend of my father who lived 2 streets over. He had called his wife on his cell phone not long before he died, informing her of a suspicious man dressed in black stalking around the neighborhood. My parents arrived home from their date to find police swarmed around the block and their home a crime scene. My father relocated at work, and we had moved across the Rockies to Salt Lake City just 2 weeks later. Kate is now a bratty middle schooler. As far as I'm concerned, she's perfect. Georgie, now 21, hasn't changed a bit, but he loses his mind if someone knocks on a window. As for me, I'm a bit of an adrenaline junkie now. I climb mountains with narrow trails and steep ridges. I go cave diving in places where you shouldn't. All, I think, in an attempt to recreate the fearful intensity of that one snowy night long ago. But it never works. The closest I come is when I'm alone, in my room, in the dead of night. Then and then alone is when the real fear sets in. Me and my case manager, R, have a meeting every week, and a few weeks ago we decided to go to a hiking trail. We took my dog Bear with us. R is 25 and I'm 22, so we get along well. Once we got to the trails, R grabbed her backpack that she had packed some granola bars and water, and off we went. We passed a couple of other people and Bear wanted to meet everyone. We talked about my progress in case management and how well my grief counseling is going. We both suddenly felt like we were being watched, but we brushed the feeling off and continued with our hike, which we would later regret. R started to talk about haunted trails, which gave me goosebumps, and I jokingly said, "R, do you have to talk about that?" A rabbit ran across the trail in front of us, and Bear wanted to go after it. Bear is a strong dog, and when he pulls on the leash, he pulls so hard, he almost yanks my shoulder out of socket, and he's real good at calming down when I tell him to. We stopped to drink some water, and R checked the time. An hour and a half had gone by, and we decided to head back down the trail. As we were walking, we noticed that all the animals that we heard earlier had gone silent. And with me growing up being around nature, I knew that when the animals go silent, there's danger nearby. Bear could sense something was wrong, and he was now on alert. The eeriness of the silence and our footsteps was something from a horror movie. I even told R, "I feel like we're in a horror movie. I feel like a monster is going to jump out, and then once we scream, a director is going to pop out and say, 'Cut.'" Bear then stopped in his tracks and looked behind us and started growling. We turned around and we saw a man who looked like he was from the 1800s. He looked like he was attacked by an animal. He had 1800s-style overalls on. Bear was growling and the hair was standing up on his back. R looked like she wanted to scream. I've never seen anyone as scared as she was. All the color drained from her face. R whispered, "You can see right through him." We finally noticed that he was floating. He started to float towards us, and R yelled, "Run!" We took off like deer being chased by a predator. I let go of the leash so Bear wouldn't drag me, but he kept pace with us. R kept looking back and the man was still chasing us, still floating. We were getting close to the bottom of the trail, and we could see the car in the distance, and R yelled, "Don't stop running!" We suddenly heard a man scream, which hurt our ears. We got to the car and R dropped her keys on the ground. I looked back and the guy was almost down the trail. I yelled, "Hurry!" R quickly picked up her keys and unlocked the car. I swung the door open and Bear jumped into the back, and then I jumped in. R started the car and sped away as soon as the man was about to reach the car. I looked out the rear window and the man was gone. We were breathing heavy and Bear was panting hard. When we got back to my apartment, we sat in my living room and tried to find anything online to see if there was any deaths or disappearances on the trail. But we couldn't find anything, and we talked about it, and R said, "That's the first time I've seen a ghost. We haven't been to the trail since, and we don't plan on going back." Bear has grown more weary and cautious of men, and he's been having nightmares more and more. I'm not sure if the nightmares are about that day, but whenever he has a nightmare, I gently say his name to wake him up, and I tell him that it's okay, and I'll lay on the floor with him to comfort him. That was truly one of the most terrifying experiences of my life, and I'm just grateful that we were able to get out of there. R says the experience scared her so bad that whenever she goes to a clothing store and sees mannequins with display overalls on them, she thinks back to that day and gets goosebumps. She even has a hard time driving past woods. She says she's scared that she might see something similar come out of the woods and she'll get the chills. My ex-boyfriend had something follow him home from his job at an Amazon warehouse. My ex and I broke up in 2018, but we remain on good terms. For privacy reasons, I will keep the location of the warehouse private. I will call my ex T for this story. He called me late last week and told me about some weird and scary things that had been happening at his house, like footsteps and knocks on the front door. I asked him to tell me when it started, and this is what followed, and it will be in his point of view. Earlier this week, as I was driving down the dirt road to get to work, I was in my own thoughts when I saw a deer leap into the road. I swerved around and I drove off the road a little bit and accidentally drove over a roadside grave. I didn't get out to inspect the grave as I was more worried about getting to work on time. After I got home that evening, the strange things started happening. I was sitting on the couch with Beans and Scoot watching TV while eating dinner. Suddenly the dogs lifted their heads up and I heard a knock on the door. So I answered it, but no one was there. So I closed the door, and as I turned around, I heard another knock. I then told myself that I wasn't getting enough sleep, so I called it a night and went to sleep with the dogs at the foot of my bed. The next day I had the day off, so I slept in until 10 a.m. After I woke up, I fed the dogs, and as I was cooking my food, I thought I heard footsteps go across my living floor. I turned around and saw that my dogs had lifted their heads to the noise. I looked all around the house, but couldn't find no sign of anyone or anything, so I just convinced myself I was just hearing things, even though I know Beans and Scoot heard it. Later that day, I decided to mow my yard, so I started up my riding lawnmower and began mowing. After finishing, I brought the lawnmower back to the shed. As I looked towards the driveway, I thought I saw a man walking to my porch. I then heard Beans and Scoot going crazy, so I booked it to the house. But when I got to the front porch, there was no one there, and once again I searched the entire house and found no one. I know for sure I saw someone, and that my dogs saw someone, and I literally thought me and my dogs were going crazy. I didn't get that much sleep that night, and the day at work I was in the break room drinking some water, when I saw a man in the corner. He looked angry, and I saw that I was able to see through him. I closed my eyes thinking he would not be there when I opened them. I suddenly felt a hand on my shoulder and my boss's voice saying, "T." I opened my eyes and my boss asked if I was okay. I looked to the corner and the man was gone. My boss said, "Look, T, you look very tired. Why don't you go home? Take the next few days off and get some rest. I'll put you down for sick leave." So I drove home and I fed my dogs some dinner and I ate a sandwich and went to sleep. I woke up about 4 hours later to Beans and Scoot barking like crazy. I woke up and saw a man in my hallway. The dogs were growling and snarling, but the man stood there. I was scared and the hair on the dogs were standing up. I said in a shaky voice, "What do you want?" The man replied in a deep voice, "Road to grave." I suddenly remembered the roadside grave I had accidentally ran over. I put my shoes on, grabbed my keys, got the dogs in the car and drove to the grave. I apologized, saying, "I'm sorry for disturbing your grave. I didn't do it on purpose. I truly am sorry. Please leave me and my dogs alone." I drove back home and nothing else has happened since. The dogs don't react to anything anymore, and I'm able to get to sleep at night. After he finished telling me the story, I told him, "Now do you believe in ghosts?" He said, "Yeah, I wish you could have experienced it." I replied, "Well, if I had a way to Texas, I would have came down there." T now says that he will pay attention to the road, and he stops by the grave every day and says a few words and puts a flower on the grave. I'm a 17-year-old girl who would babysit for a family I knew extremely well. My younger sister was friends with the little boy from the family. We'll call him Chris for privacy reasons. I absolutely adored Chris's younger sister, Lily, which is the main reason their mother had asked me to babysit for them. I was honestly excited as I really enjoyed spending time with both kids. Their mom was going out to dinner with friends, and she wouldn't be home until much later in the night. The night of babysitting approached, and everything had been fine. I'd been playing some Minecraft with the two of them for quite a while, and later ordered a pizza for us all to share. Eventually 9 p.m. approached and it was the kids' bedtime. The excitement must have wiped them out because they didn't fight me at all. Once they were both asleep in their rooms, I sat on the couch in the living room and watched Netflix. For context, behind the living room is the staircase which leads to upstairs. So from where I was sitting, even though my back was facing it, I could see if someone was standing on the staircase. I was about halfway into an episode of my show when I then heard footsteps descending down the stairs. Assuming it was either Chris or Lily, I called out both of their names. No answer. Either I imagined it, or it was just one of them getting up to use the bathroom or something. I continued to watch my show until I saw something in the reflection of the grandfather clock. Right next to the TV, there was a faint outline of a little girl leaning over the railing of the stairs. I wasn't panicked at all initially, as I figured it was just Lily who had woken up. I turned from the couch to look at the stairs, only to be met with an empty staircase. There was nobody there. I whipped my head back around to face the grandfather clock, and the reflection was gone. I felt my stomach plummet, and my heartbeat started to spike. Unnerved, I paused the TV and looked back at the staircase. Nothing. Maybe the reflection had just been from the TV, and this was all in my head. That was the only plausible explanation. The only way I was going to find out for sure was if I checked both kids. Reluctantly, I got up and I walked up the staircase. I opened the door to Chris's room to find him sound asleep. I then made my way over to Lily's room, only to find her asleep as well. I walked further into her room just to double-check if she was really fully asleep, and she was. My heart still racing, I was just baffled. What the hell had I seen in the reflection, if Lily was genuinely asleep? I turned to leave the room, only to stop dead in my tracks. There was a girl standing in the hallway, a girl who definitely wasn't Lily. She was sickeningly pale and wearing a white nightgown. I felt like my heart was going to come up my throat. Frozen in fear, it took a few seconds to come back to reality, and then slam the door and lock it. My heart is pounding so fiercely I feel like I'm going to puke. I just stood there, leaning against the door for a solid minute, heart racing and breathing heavy. That's when I then heard a knock on the door, and I jumped, screaming bloody murder. "Hey, it's just me," I heard Chris say from the other side of the door. Instant relief washed over me as I opened the door to see Chris. He just stood there, eyes wide, with this absolutely unnerved expression, clutching his little creeper stuffed animal. "What's wrong?" he asked me quietly. Lily had woken up as well, sitting up in bed with a confused expression. I didn't want to scare either of them, and little kids will panic if they see an adult actually freaked out. So I lied. I was just watching a scary movie downstairs, I tell them. When I came up to check on you guys, I guess I was just caught off guard. Sorry for waking you. They both went back to bed, and I returned back downstairs to try and become calm again. I resumed my TV show, and I was reaching the end when I suddenly had the urge to look in the reflection once again. Big mistake. I looked back only to see the clear face of a young girl, the one from the hallway, gaunt black eyes boring straight into me. Without another thought, I immediately sprung off the couch and sprinted up the stairs. I scooped Lily up out of bed and yanked Chris out of his. I fumbled for my car keys out of my bag, my hands shaking and my mind yelling a million different things at me. I booked it for my car. I don't even remember if I looked down the driveway before peeling out and speeding towards my home. Chris and Lily slept in the guest room in my house that night. I texted the mother that their house had lost power that night, so I had taken them to mine. My family was super close to theirs, so I didn't think it would be a big deal. When she came to pick them up, their mother asked me to babysit again, but I turned her down politely. It's not that I didn't like the kids. There was just no way in hell I was going to deal with that again. A few weeks later, my sister was invited for a play date with Chris. My parents, their mom, and I were all eating lunch together when Chris and Lily's mom brought up she was looking into moving. She started to complain, hearing weird noises and seeing things by the staircase. Shock hit me like a bucket of cold water. Their mom continued on, explaining that she went to go do research on the house and had come across some unsettling things. During the 1920s, a family with 2 daughters lived there. Their youngest had died of pneumonia, and her bedroom was Lily's. Previous owners of the house had complained of the same things. I wasn't crazy, but I would be if I ever went back into that house again. This was years ago now, but I remember it. I remember all of it. I loved the forest and I loved hunting, but not anymore. That night the moon was full, but the trees choked its light. Streams of silver fought for every inch, peeking through the canopy. Footfalls in the forest echoed, the crunch of leaves and the snapping of twigs announcing my presence. I wasn't lost, but I hadn't found what I'm looking for. Earlier that day, I shot a deer. It felt wrong. That's the best way to explain it. Just wrong. I had no luck, sitting in my stand for hours. Then it walked out of the tree line, a huge buck. It strolled right to the center of the clearing, its head pivoting side to side and then up. It was looking straight at me. I took aim, lining up my crosshairs on the deer. A voice in the back of my head whispered, "Don't do it." Why, I thought. "Just don't take the shot," the voice insisted. I lined up my crosshairs again, the deer, unblinking, glassy black eyes staring up at me. Why isn't it running? My chest started to tighten. "I don't know, but don't do it," the voice persisted. I curled my finger around the trigger and began to squeeze. "No, don't shoot that deer," the voice screamed in my head. I knew I shouldn't have pulled that trigger, but I did. God, what I'm saying doesn't even make sense, but it's what I saw. It's what I did. I shot that deer and it didn't budge. It took that bullet between the shoulder blades like a mosquito bite. It flicked its ear, licked its nose, turned its head, and walked back to the gap between the trees, vanishing. I climbed down from the tree stand and approached the spot where I'd shot the deer. There was blood, but it wasn't right. The wound I'd made in the deer's chest was mere moments ago, yet the blood on the ground was already clotted and dried. I followed the blood trail into the trees. The smell, God, the smell was horrible, like the stench of swamp mud and rot. Something was off, but I had to track it. My dad instilled in me strong hunting ethics. Know your gun, shoot only when certain, and always track down wounded game. I can't explain why I felt the way I did. Watching it walk back into the woods made my stomach drop. But why? It wasn't a deer. It saw you. It took that bullet like a slap on the back. Then what was it? I don't know, but it wasn't a deer. The forest around me was alive with the sounds of summer, the chirping of crickets, the hoot of an owl, frogs joining the chorus on cue. Everything was in motion. I followed the blood trail, refusing to give up for the night. I had to find it. Suddenly, the blood trail stopped at the base of a large tree. The blood had been heavy and constant up to this point. I scanned the area with my flashlight, but there was nothing. Where could it have gone? Then something thick and sticky struck my forehead. I reached up, touched it, and brought my fingers into the light. Red. Blood. I shone my light up the tree, and there it was. Halfway up the trunk, blood. Further up on one of the branches, more blood. What the heck? That's not possible. I tried to rationalize. Had the deer succumbed to its injuries and been dragged up the tree by something? No, there wasn't enough blood for that, and there were no remains. How did blood get up in the tree? It must be from another wounded animal, not the one I'm tracking. Perhaps I got swapped onto its trail instead. No, it can't be. I know I've been tracking the same trail the whole time. The only explanation is that the deer, that thing I shot, scaled this tree. Deer don't climb. So where is it now? I shone my light into the treetops, but there was nothing. The branches were bare, no sign of life anywhere. Well, crap. Now what? I decided to make camp since the trail was dead and there was nothing left to track. I set up my tent and gathered some wood for a fire beneath the tree. I tried to get some rest, but sleep wouldn't come. I kept replaying the events from earlier over and over again. The more I thought about it, the less anything made sense. And the less sense things made, the more threatened I felt. I sat up, stoked the fire, and grabbed my weapon. I was ready to fight. Maybe not to win, but to fight. "What are you doing?" a voice in my head asked. "I just want to be ready," I replied. "Ready for what?" the voice persisted. "I'm not sure, but it makes me feel better." "No, you know." "Know what?" "You shouldn't have shot that deer." Sitting by my fire, I remained at the ready, constantly scanning the area and listening to every sound the forest threw at me. The night was loud. The forest was alive with creatures, all caught in a perpetual state of hunting or hiding. Then, faintly, I heard a snapping sound. I turned and raised my gun toward the void. The orange glow of the fire danced on the barrel, illuminating the campsite but revealing nothing beyond. I decided not to use my flashlight. I wanted complete control of my weapon. Motionless, I sat, listening intently. Nothing, just the crackling of the fire. Yeah, that's all it was, I told myself. Nothing there. I knew that wasn't true, but it was the only thing I could say to convince myself to lower the gun. The night dragged on, but I survived, despite the occasional kamikaze moth pelting me. As dawn broke, the cool morning air, tinged with a light blue hue, enveloped the forest. It was a welcome change from the heat that lay ahead. A thick fog had rolled in. I extinguished the remnants of the fire, packed my gear, and prepared to head to the pickup location. My friend wouldn't be able to get me for another day, but at least I'd be ready. I squatted down to retrieve my packed bag, slinging it over my shoulders in one swift motion. The swirling fog parted where the bag had lain, revealing something I hadn't noticed before. Tracks. Not just any tracks, deer tracks, hundreds of them. The hoof prints struck deep into the damp ground around the campsite, forming a perfect circle around my camp. This thing had circled me all night long, just beyond the light of the fire. But that couldn't be. I would have heard something. I mean, there were hundreds of tracks. It would have had to make noise at some point. Upon further inspection of the formation, it became apparent there were no tracks showing entry or exit from the area. It was like the deer had materialized right beside the campsite and then vanished. "Forget this, I am out of here," I muttered to myself as I began the long trek to the pickup location. However, I decided not to stop there. I'd hike down the logging road to the mouth of the main dirt road that my buddy would have to drive down to get to the meetup spot. Honestly, it didn't do much in getting me out of here any sooner, but it was good to have a mission to work towards. Any amount of time shaved off in these woods was better. Most of the hike was uneventful. I was approaching well over halfway to the meeting spot when I decided it was time for a break. I rummaged around in my bag for water and a protein bar. I was making great time. At this rate, a few more hours of hiking, and I would be on the logging road in no time, and only a half-hour hike from the main dirt road. Snap! A branch popped behind me. Lifting my gun and swinging around to the noise in one fluid motion, I scanned the area behind me. The forest is thick this time of year, so my view of my surroundings is limited. This thing could be mere feet away, and I wouldn't see it. The iron sights of my rifle glided across the forest, and then I stopped. I saw something. a big patch of brush, but something was off with it. At the top of a large bush, there were weird branches coming out, oddly bare. No, not branches, antlers. My hands tightened around my weapon as I pulled its buttstock tight against my shoulder. Tunnel vision kicked in. I saw nothing aside from the bush. Then I guessed where the head would be relative to the exposed antlers. I took aim and squeezed the trigger. The kick of the gun jolted my insides. A loud, thunderous bang ripped through the forest, followed by the burnt smell of gunpowder. It didn't even flinch. No movement at all from this thing. The tips of its antlers were still visible. Then the exposed points slowly lowered down and out of sight into the brush. Everything was still. Everything was quiet. Everything was wrong. I grabbed my bag and began to run, as fast as the forest would let me, towards the direction of the logging road. Tearing through the woods, between the snapping and whipping of vines and branches, I could swear I heard something tailing me. But I didn't care. I just wanted out. So I kept running. I burst through the thicket and into open air, the resistance of the forest vanishing and toppling me forward onto the dusty red earth. An orange cloud surrounded me as I slid across the dirt road. I rolled over, facing where I had exited the tree line, chest heaving, waiting for that thing to rip through the foliage and jump on me. But as I sat on the road, gun up, nothing came out of the woods. It was still. I think I'm losing my freaking mind. I lifted myself up from the dirt, brushed off my clothing, and gathered my bearings. It's this way. I started down the dirt path, hiking for a few minutes before a section of cleared forest came into view on the right side of the path. It was an old logging site. Stumps jutted up like headstones in a tree graveyard. The clearing was littered with the tracks of trucks and the branches of past harvests. A wide open expanse of mangled wood and debris. This is as far as I go for now. The sun will be going down in a few hours, and there's no point in going further. Plus, this will make a great spot for camp. The best part about it is plenty of firewood, an open view of my surroundings, and the ground is completely littered with branches, so I'll hear it coming. No trees mean no cover for it from my shots. Yeah, this is as good as it gets. One last night, and then my buddy should be here first thing in the morning to get me. Just one more night. For the last time I set up camp, stacked a quick pile of firewood, and stood guard as the sun dipped below the horizon. The night crept in from the forest around me. I could sense I wasn't alone. The feeling had been lingering before dusk, but now it was closer, more persistent. The hours passed slowly. The wind was relentless, constantly threatening to snuff out my flames. I kept shifting my position to shield the fire with my body, but it was barely enough to keep it lit. The darkness was thicker than the night before, with no moon or stars, only clouds blanketing the sky and its light. It was quieter tonight. There were no sounds of bugs or animals, just the rustling trees and howling wind. Time dragged on with nothing happening. Dawn was just a couple of hours away. I made it, I thought. Maybe I am losing my mind. Then I saw it, a silhouette approaching my camp. The fire cast a faint glow, but I couldn't make out any details. It looked like my buddy. Maybe he's ahead of schedule and was drawn by the light of my fire. I stood up to greet him, but froze mid-stride as the figure moved closer, the darkness around it melting away. It wasn't my buddy. It wasn't even a man. The legs were too skinny, the arms hung at odd angles, and what looked like long hair rose from its shoulders in writhing lines above its head. As it stepped into the light, I saw it clearly, every horrifying detail. It was that deer, but not a deer, not at all. This thing continued walking straight toward me. It moved on its hind legs like a man. The forearms, now drooping in front of its body, ended in claws instead of hooves. Its jaw hung loosely on its hinge, revealing rows upon rows of jagged, malformed teeth. Its antlers now more resembled tentacles whipping the air around it, and its eyes, no longer on the sides of its head, had shifted to the center of its face, one atop the other. I raised my gun, took aim, and then something from the sky hit my hand, then my cheek. It ran down my face and off my chin. It had started to rain. The sky opened up, unleashing a downpour that extinguished my fire in seconds, plunging me into darkness. The last sight I had of this thing was it advancing on me. I fired my gun into the dark. The flash from the discharge revealed nothing of its location. but I saw my flashlight on the ground to my left. I could hear nothing over the ringing in my ears from the shot. Even the beating of the rain was lost to me. Keeping my gun raised, I bent down with one arm outstretched, feeling around the ground for the flashlight until I touched the familiar smoothness of plastic against the rough earth. I grabbed it, and as I did, I felt fur brush against my outstretched arm. I swung the gun in that direction and pulled the trigger. The recoil threw the gun from my hand, and I felt something warm and sticky splatter across my face. Clutching the flashlight, I dug my feet into the ground and pushed off into a sprint. I clicked on the light and picked a direction, the rain beating against my face, washing sweat into my eyes, making them sting. Each falling droplet obscured more of my light, leaving me barely enough visibility to keep my footing. I ran and ran until my eye hit even ground, the light illuminating the muddy path of the dirt road. I continued down the path until I lost my footing, sliding in the mud. The flashlight bounced ahead of me, landing with its beam pointed back in the direction I had come from. I rolled over onto my back and saw a tall, shadowy figure running up the path toward me. Scrambling to my feet, I left the light where it lay and let my instincts guide me. I didn't stop running until my footsteps slapped against pavement. I had made it all the way to the main highway. The sun was beginning to rise over the trees. I walked along the side of the road until I heard a familiar voice call out behind me. "Hey!" I stopped and turned to see my buddy half hanging out the window of his truck, a look of concern and confusion on his face. "What the heck happened to you?" he asked, hopping out of the driver's side door. I paused and just stared at him, unsure of how to explain. How could anyone understand? I finally said the only thing that made any sense. I shot a deer. So, back in 2019, I remember there being a big uproar of unknown creatures roaming the forest, like Bigfoot and skinwalkers. But this story isn't about them. This story is about probably one of the scariest things I think I've ever heard about: the Wendigo. A few months after one of my friends, Jacob, mentioned this big uproar, I went to go see him since I had been away enlisted in the United States Marines. I got back after being discharged, and one of the first things I did was go and see him. We're having a good old time, and he brought up the idea of going out to a little hangout spot his now ex-girlfriend took him to when they wanted to get away for a few hours. So I decided, why not? So I grabbed my gun, and we went out to this extremely secluded area and started messing around on the old dock that was there. It had been pretty much forgotten by the looks of it, poorly maintained, and some boards were almost completely rotted through. So about 30 minutes into our shenanigans, Jacob brought up the topic of the Wendigo. The name sounded a little scary, even for me. Curious, I asked him about it. He said that if you went into the woods and said Wendigo 3 times, you would come across the scariest looking thing you've ever seen. Me calling his bluff, I told him to prove it. To this day, I wished I hadn't. We start walking on this little path that lead deep into the thick woods close to the Alabama state line. We walked for maybe 20-ish minutes and decided we were in a good spot. I feel it's worth knowing that it had been raining a lot over the past couple days, so the ground was completely saturated with water. I turned to Jacob and he dares me to do it. I stood there in complete silence. The rest of the forest was almost silent as well, besides the tall pines swaying in the wind high above our heads. Reluctantly, I slowly started to say it. Wendigo, Wendigo, Wendigo. Then, nothing happened. I let out a silent sigh of relief at the fact that nothing happened. One thing about mine and Jacob's friendship is we loved it when one of us proved the other wrong about something. In our friendship of 10 years, I think it was one of the first times I had proven him wrong at anything. We started to talk a little bit of shit back and forth at each other when we heard a noise in the distance. Me still having the reflexes I had from the Marines, I immediately snapped towards the direction of the noise that were just then turning into asterisk noises. Asterisk. I started to move closer to then noises, and then shortly after we saw a few coyotes running across the path about 30 feet in front of us. I breathed another sigh of relief, but that relief didn't last long since I knew something was up. I didn't know what was up at first, but I just knew it was time for me and Jacob to leave. As we turned to leave the woods, all of a sudden a tall pine tree started to groan and creak as it started to come down. Noticing this, and in a moment of pure instinct, I shoved Jacob forward as the tree came falling through the rest of the branches and landed right in between us. Jacob let out a cry of terror as the tree landed, and I hopped the tree to get to him. I could feel his heart pounding like a drum as I grabbed him by his shirt and yanked him to his feet. He was still terrified and still practically crying as I screamed at the top of my lungs, "Move, Jacob! Fucking move now!" I spun him around really hard, causing him to fall to his knees. I quickly got him up and we both started to sprint down the path back in the direction we came. I didn't dare look back, and neither did Jacob. I was sprinting through the woods when a familiar sound came from behind me. "Jacob, Jacob, come quick." It was the sound of Jacob's younger sister, Olivia. He turned and tried to get past me. The whole time he was screaming, "Olivia!" I stopped him and said, "Jacob, look at me. It's not her. Do you hear me? It's not her." Just then another pine tree started to buckle. I saw it just in time to tackle Jacob down to the ground as both of us were nearly crushed. I screamed at Jacob once more. "Go, get out of here, go now." As I was screaming that, I pulled my gun out of my waistband and aimed it down the trail in the direction from whence we came. Jacob made it to the opening of the trail and turned back and noticed I was still aiming my gun down the trail. "Bradley, get out of there, Simon, hurry." I turned and started sprinting towards him. As I made it into the clearing a good 50 feet, I turned and me and Jacob both saw it. The thing we had ushered into showing itself. The Wendigo. It stood about 9 feet tall on its hind legs. There was practically no meat on its bones. It had really skinny legs and even skinnier arms. Its skin a pale white, almost like a vampire's. But the thing I noticed the most about it were the eyes. A vibrant blue, almost like lightsaber blue for those who have seen Star Wars. Having had enough fear, I raised my gun and fired at the Wendigo. Jacob, not sticking around to see if I had killed it, turned and ran towards the car. I turned and did the same thing as he passed me. That was my first experience with this so-called Wendigo, and I pray, almost every night, I never have to encounter something that terrifying again. So this was when I was about 4 or 5 years old. I'm from East Los Angeles. A lot of people know it to be as the one of the most Latino population in California. So in my culture, we grew hearing and believing in the stories of brujas and demons and spirits, as did everyone in the neighborhood. One night in particular changed my life forever. My father was working in another state. We didn't have a house at the time, so we stayed with my great aunt and my grandfather, my mother's father and aunt. My grandfather's house was like a walk stone behind my aunt's house, so pretty close. My grandfather's house was small. He only had one bedroom, which was his. He always went to bed early. So me, my big brother, and my mom slept in the living room. I slept on the floor with my mother, as I was the smallest. My big brother, which is 8 years older than me, slept on the couch. So on this night, it's pitch black, and for some odd reason, it was lightning and thundering. Not rain though, just flashes of lightning and a rumble sound of thunder. So I'm sleeping, which I happen to be a heavy sleeper. Usually takes a lot to wake me up, so I'm out. But then all of a sudden I feel as if something was watching me, like, as if eyes are on you in a public place. I get up because of that feeling, and I look around. The lights are off, and there is one spot in a corner by the couch, which my brother is on, that appears darker than the rest of the house, almost like black endless hole. So I figured it's probably just my sleep playing with me. I go back to bed, throw the covers on my head. All of a sudden, I feel something land on my legs. I feel as if someone or something has their feet on me, so I try to just brush it off. Probably my mom just moving over the blanket. But then I feel walking up my legs, and so I kind of panic. I slowly creeped out of the covers, and I almost slither out of the area, and what I saw would forever be with me. I saw almost what resembled a chicken with green apple eyes, had almost black feathers, and it looked half-shaved, its wrinkled skin, and what stood out me most was its feet and its wrist. Looked almost like human, with black pointy nails. Looked as if it were an elder woman's wrist, and it had a hunch over back. It was probably about maybe the size of a Rottweiler. It started to walk towards me, and my feeling was this numbness of cold, shivering down my spine. I couldn't even scream or make a sound. Only thing in reflex to do for me was to sit still. This hunch-over thing was making its way to me, and I muster up some feeling to slowly walk back to the front of my grandfather's front door. And then the creature had stopped dead, In its tracks looked like it had almost a grin. It reached it, wrinkled sharp nails and wrinkled hand, and extended it to me. Now I must have had luck on my side, because a flash lightning had flashed, and the creature in the blink of an eye just vanished. Nowhere could I see anything, as if it was just disappeared. I stayed up the whole night in the corner till the next morning. In shock, didn't even say anything to my brother or mom, for they would think I was not serious. My grandfather, who was in the Navy, wasn't really a believer in those stories. So I told the only person I know who would not think I was insane. I told her, Tia, the other night I saw something in my papa house. It was almost like a chicken, and it had black feathers. And she looked as if something's bothering her, and said, Mijo, that was a bruja, a woman that is a witch who are said to steal children in the middle of the night. You must have not truly been afraid, just in a trance. Something inside you broke it. Ever since that horrible night, I never saw it again, but my beliefs in my culture grew into my obsession with paranormal still. Till this day, I wonder what was it that broke that bruja's trance. So, before I tell the story, I'm going to introduce myself and give some background history. I'm Morgan, and I live in a small town in the countryside of New York near a reservation. It all started when I was 2 years old. My mother has told me all about the night terrors I'd have between the ages 2 to 5 years old. The first time, apparently, I'd wake any time between 12 to 3 a.m. My eyes would be wide open, and I'd be standing upright in my crib bed. She'd notice my finger pointing to the left corner every night, saying, "He's here." After, I'd go back to sleep and haven't remembered doing such thing the night before. It stopped once I turned 5 years old and went away for a couple years. The second time was when I turned 21. That's when it started getting weird. I started seeing a shadow of a little boy in the corner of my current room. He would just sit there and stare, and then suddenly disappeared. About a month before my 22nd birthday, I was on my way to work at 6 in the morning. I was driving, a little tired, but of course awake and cautious. I wasn't sure if I was hallucinating or if I actually saw a person, maybe around 6 feet tall, walk across the thruway. It was just a black shadow. I nearly swerved off the road and decided to pull over for a bit. When I turned my head back around, I looked and there was nothing there. So I thought maybe I was just tired and imagining it. About 2 weeks later, I was heading to bed and fell asleep. This is where I got scared and terrified for the life of me. I was in a dreamlike state. It looked like I was inside a building with the Japanese sliding doors. I felt lost and confused because it felt so real. Next thing you know, the doors open. It was the same shadow figure I saw in the thruway the one day. But this time I could make out the features, and it was taller, maybe around 9 to 10 feet tall. It had bright red eyes, as if there was a fire burning. When I thought I was awake, which I somehow wasn't, I saw it. It was standing right above me, hovering me in my bed. My body froze up as if I was paralyzed. I couldn't move anything or even shut my eyes. I was in shock and felt like I couldn't even scream. But I managed to yell my sister's name. Let's call her Elle. I yelled for Elle twice, thinking it was 3 a.m., and then when I went to look up, it was gone. When my alarm for work went off, I got up and went to work having a normal day. But when I got home, I had to ask my sister. I asked her, "Did you hear me this morning?" She replied, "Yes." But it didn't sound like me yelling or screaming. To her, it sounded like I was whispering, but that I sounded terrified. That's when she told me, an hour before my alarm went off, she felt uneasy. It felt as if she knew something was bound to happen. It's now March of 2023, and I saw it again for the last time, hopefully. My car was parked in my spot, and usually I turn around to check and make sure my headlights shut off. When I turned around to look, there it was, standing right in front of the hood of my car, staring straight at me. My family and I never travel, but being that we had to travel out of state for serious medical treatments, we took our RV to Golden, Colorado in the winter. We were required to leave early in the morning and make our way to the facility to drop off a family member, only to pick her up at the end of the day. This would last about 2 weeks. That's the normal part of the story, but during the day is when things went south really fast. I'm usually clean-shaven, so I look considerably younger than I am. People have told me I look like I'm somewhere between 18 or 21, which never bothered me at all. That part is important because without realizing it at first, I attracted a couple of stalkers in the first week. It's also important to note that I carried a Beretta and a revolver in the RV for protection. We are dog lovers, and so we took our Chihuahua and Bichon Frise on the trip. Because of this, I took them out regularly for their potty breaks and a quick run each time at a local park that we thought was safe enough to hang out for the day. The first day or two went by without any issues aside from shady vehicles that never left the parking lot. My dad was somewhat concerned and eventually parked on the other side of the park away from everyone else. That was our first mistake. I was with my dog one afternoon and I heard a buzzing sound like a horde of bees flying nearby, but seen nothing until I looked up about 10 feet above me. Someone programmed a drone to lock onto me so that every time I moved, the drone would follow me. I instantly picked up my dog and started running. The drone moved with me until finally it broke away and raced across the park and out of sight. I locked ourselves in the RV and told my dad about what happened and decided to take off to a different area. Psychologically speaking, I was constantly looking around and being hypersensitive to anyone walking around us. That nearly saved me the next day, because it wasn't the last time I attracted attention. We experienced a cold snap during the night and thought things would be safe if we returned to the park in another parking spot. This time, however, I made sure I was packing heat. I know what you're thinking. What about the police? That's the part I forgot to mention. Although the police department swears on the Bible that Denver has police patrolling the city, we never seen them in any part of Denver. Their cover story is pretty much as you'd expect. They just weren't on the street at the time you were there. I want to believe that, but the local crime stories we started hearing told us a different story. With that being said, I took one of our dogs again for his potty break on the sidewalk that someone cleaned up for us. I started hearing someone whistling deeper in the park, where the trees were too thick for me to see past. My dogs are always leashes, so even if the whistling got their attention, they wouldn't be able to follow the sound. Now, I know this part will sound cliché, but it's true. Shortly after hearing someone whistling from behind the trees in the park, a black SUV pulled up in front of our RV, making me feel suspicious about their intentions. One of the passengers got out and checked his phone for a minute. In the meantime, I was already picking up my dog because he finished his business and closed my other hand around my pistol inside my jacket pocket. Before I arrived at the RV door, passenger who got out was already walking towards me, so I quickly got inside and locked it behind me. I told my dad to get us out of the park, and we took a very long drive out of Denver until we had to pick up our family member at the end of the day. Of course, following the events, I suffered a couple of weeks with the PTSD that usually follows events like these. For the legalists out there judging me, yes, I know concealed carry wasn't lawful in my case, but it was either getting kidnapped, killed, or spending time in jail for concealed carrying as a non-resident. I'd rather risk the latter and still be above ground. Otherwise, it's been about a month and a half since it happened, and I'm not as bothered by it like I used to be. But honestly, I certainly don't want to visit Denver until they can actually get a handle on the crime. Two nights ago, I had a very odd dream. One of a few I've had. The specific part I remember will be told now. So to give a layout of my house, it opens up into our mudroom. Then through the doorway, it's our kitchen dining room. If you walk through the next doorway, you come into our living room, right beside the steps that go to the second floor. To the other side are our couches, which are in front of the TV on the mantel. There is a door right by our stairs landing that leads out to part of our deck. On the wall behind the landing, there is a window. Near that door, there is a small-ish circular window about 5 feet off the ground. Close to that is our sliding glass door, which leads to the main part of the deck. Now, to the story. It takes place sometime in winter, probably January. There was still ice on the lake, if that is any help. I was near the sliding glass door when I saw my cat, except it wasn't my cat. Its fur was more rugged and slightly shorter, and his eyes were more human. So I opened the door and state, "I know you are not my cat, get out." I remember being like super sleepy after shutting the door, and I collapsed on the ground. When I got back up, there was this emaciated man with a weird expression on his face. His expression was like that on the Scream mask, if that helps you imagine it. His eyes were very dark and he had skin pulled down. It was as if it was stuck there. There was dried blood coming from them. He wore a blue plaid shirt with the pen pocket in the front, tan khaki pants with black shoes. I went up to the glass and asked what it was. It replied in a very smooth, unsettling voice. "I am a skinwalker," is what it told me. I stumbled backwards, panicking as it came closer. Then it transformed. It was now a big pitch-black figure with glowing white eyes. Its body shape was that of a stereotypical werewolf, except it was extremely emaciated. Something made me ask what it was. It responded Windwalker in the same voice. I don't remember what ensued. I believe we had a small conversation. That's when my mom came storming up and snapped, "Don't talk to it," and quickly shut the curtains we have for the door. Not wanting to leave on bad terms with it, I quickly waved. It returned the wave before the curtain was fully shut. Sometime later I heard rustling. I looked at our window and saw it. Terrified, I hid in the corner, pressing myself up against the wall to hide, hoping it wouldn't see me. Something told me it was not going to be as friendly this time. I remember it was looking in every window, like it was trying to spot me. I woke up after that, but even after 2 days, I still remember this dream vividly. Hi, I have been listening to your content for a while now and love the channel. I felt that it is time to share my experience that I lived in my early teen years, and I hope to encourage people to not dabble with evil entities. So here goes. This has happened to me many years ago, which is about spiritualism via playing with a Ouija board. When I was about 15 years old, some childhood friends and I were quite fascinated with paranormal things like ghosts, private base phenomena such as UFOs, etc. We would sometimes venture out to such places to try and counter things. Mind you, we are talking about the mid to late 90s, when intelligent phones did not exist, but digital gadgets were on the cusp of breakthrough. Anyways, one day a friend and I, during summer vacation, decided to get a Kia board and go to another best friend's house and play with it. Everything went according to plan. In the morning we met up, obtained a Ouija board from a local supermarket, and went to our friend's house in the neighborhood we all grew up in. We gathered in his bedroom, turned the lights off, lit a couple candays, and asked it questions. It moved slightly, but really never got any type of full-on encounter or experience. So we said whatever, and continued the day of hanging out and enjoying each other's company during summer vacation, typical teenage summer vacation fun. But this is where the crazy stuff began. Around a week or so later, I was at my house laying down on my bed in my bedroom around 8 p.m. I was just laying down relaxing, listening to music. Then all of a sudden, I heard footsteps run up my bedroom wall outside of the house and then run across the roof quite quickly. Now my bed was against the wall, and I literally heard the footsteps run up the same wall outside of where my bed was against, and it sounded like a child running quickly. That was the length and span of each step, and it sounded like the entity was bipedal and running really fast. I then was quite surprised and didn't know what to do. I then went to the kitchen where my mom was washing the dishes, and I asked if my stepdad was on the roof doing some type of maintenance, and my mom was surprised at the question and said, "No, he's not up on the roof." I then returned to my room and thought about it for a while. Eventually I forgot about it. Shortly after, I recall late at night when everyone was asleep, I would suddenly feel fear out of nowhere in my room and suddenly get paralyzed. It was crazy, because when I felt the fear, it felt like a super fast rush of wind would race towards me and fill me, enter my being, and I would be paralyzed. My eyes rolled back all the way, and it was a level of fear and rage that I cannot describe in human words that would fill my whole being. Such incident would begin to happen about once a week and evolve to 2, 3 times a week for about 4 years throughout high school. Then it got to a point where one night I sensed the same fear enter my room while my whole family was asleep in their respective rooms, and again such entity rushed and entered my body. My body arched, and then I felt my celly levitate to the ceiling where my nose almost touched the ceiling. Then my body slowly returned back to the bed. I remember feeling everything and being able to see even though my eyes were rolled to the back of my eye sockets. I was able to feel the bed sheets over my body and hanging, and I was able to see how I was levitating nearer to the ceiling and everything. There was another incident where the same thing happened, and while I was paralyzed in such state, I remember using all my force and energy and moved my head towards the door of my bedroom, because while I was paralyzed, it was super hard to move any body part, let alone my mouth to scream for help or anything. And after looking at the bedroom door, in an attempt to run and escape such horrifying experience, I mustered up as much energy and motivation possible, and I tried leaping off my bed to run for the door. What I'm about to describe is unbelievable, but I'm speaking from first-hand experience. And my inner self, soul or spirit, jumped out of my body and I hit the floor. I then started crawling to the door and was going to reach for the doorknob, but then I looked back to the bed and saw my body paralyzed with my eyes rolled back. I couldn't believe it. Then all of a sudden my soul spirit rushed back to my body and the entity left my body. The word terrifying does not begin to describe what one feels in such experiences. There were other nights where my mom, stepdad, and siblings would go grocery shopping at night, and I would stay at home watching TV. And while in the living room, I would hear about 15, 20 feet away from the living room, down the hall were the 3 bedrooms of the house, where I would hear one doorknob of one of the rooms turning and letting go, turning and letting go. Obviously, Nuna was in the house and I would feel a presence back there but did not dare to go investigate. I remember calling one of my best friends on the phone to distract my attention from that. Also, when those things were happening, every time I laid down on my bed sideways at night with my back facing the room and my face towards the wall, I would always hear people whispering in the room right behind me, and when I turned around to see, the whispers stopped. It would happen so much that I stopped laying down sideways to sleep, or if I laid down sideways, my face would be towards the room and my back against the wall. I can describe so many more experiences, but I would have to turn this into a book with chapters. LOL. Thankfully, years have passed. I am a full-grown man now, and those experiences and entity have dwindled away. I started going to church and it all faded away. To conclude, my word of advice is, never dabble with a Ouija board.